In October of 1994, a mill metallurgist named Dale Brunner stood at a wire fence in Vance County, Ohio, looked at the gray mountain of waste the steel plant had been hauling onto the strip of land beside it, and told the man who farmed that strip that he was sitting on a liability. 11 years later, in the spring of 2005, a county road engineer signed a purchase order for $40,000 of that same waste, screened and sized and bagged, under a name stenciled on a barn wall, and called it the best base aggregate he had spaced in 20 years of paving. Between those two moments lay a fence line, a refusal, a daughter who came home with a degree she thought made her smarter than her father, and a man named Walt Haney who never once raised his voice. This is the story of the years that connected them, and of what a man can build out of a thing nobody else wanted. Let me tell you about Walt Haney first, because everything turns on the kind of man he was. He was 61 years old that autumn, and he had worked the same 140 acres along the Tylersville Road his whole life, the way his father had before him. He was known for two things in that part of the county. The first was that he almost never spoke unless he had something to say, which made the things he did say carry a weight other men's words did not. The second was that he could look at a load of crushed stone, run his hand through it once, and tell you within a few dollars what it would cost a township to spread it and how long it would hold up under a loaded gravel truck. He had hauled and spread and graded stone on the side for 30 years. A small operation, he ran with one dump truck and a borrowed loader, and the road crews in 3 townships knew that what Walt told them about a material was simply true. His land sat in a hard spot. The Vance Steel Works had opened a finishing mill on the parcel next to his in 1971. And from the beginning, the two operations had lived along the same wire fence, the mill on one side throwing its noise and its trucks and its lights into the night. Walt had never fought the mill, he understood it, employed 400 people, and that the men who worked the furnaces came from families he had gone to school with. What he had not counted on was the slag. Let me tell you what slag is, because the whole story depends on understanding it, and most people who have never stood near a steel furnace have no idea. When you melt iron ore and scrap and limestone together to make steel, the metal sinks and a molten layer of everything else floats up on top of it. That floating layer is the impurities, the silica and the lime and the oxides, and the furnace men skim it off and pour it out and let it cool. What cools is a hard, glassy gray rock, dense and angular and sharp-edged. The steel industry made millions of tons of it every year, and for most of the 20th century treated it as garbage, a waste stream to be hauled somewhere and dumped. There were 2 kinds, broadly. The slag that came off the blast furnace was one thing. The slag that came off the steel furnace itself, the kind Vance Steel made, was another, and it carried a quiet problem inside it that would matter very much later. In 1990, the mill needed somewhere to put it. The state had tightened the rules on what a mill could leave sitting in an open pile near a waterway, and the Tylersville Creek ran along the back of the mill property, and the cheapest answer the mill's people could find was the long, flat strip of low ground that ran between the mill fence and Walt Haney's bean field. It was Walt's land. The mill sent a man to ask, and the man offered a number that was not generous but was not nothing, a few $1,000s a year, to let the trucks come and dump on the strip and grade it flat. Walt looked at the strip which flooded most springs and had never grown him a decent crop, and he thought about the money, and he said yes. He signed a lease that let the mill dump steel slag on 11 acres of his ground for as long as both parties agreed to continue. His wife, Edith, thought he was a fool. She said so at the kitchen table the night he signed, the old oak table his grandfather had built from a walnut that came down in the back lot, and she set it playing. "You let them turn your own land into their junkyard," she said, "and someday you will want that ground back, and it will be buried under 100 years of rock." Walt heard her out. He always heard her out. Then he said the thing that would turn out to be the whole of his character in one sentence. "Edith," he said, "a man does not throw away rock until he knows what the rock is." And he went to bed. She did not understand it then. Neither did I the first time I walked that fence line and heard the story. It sounded like stubbornness dressed up as wisdom. It was not. It was the patience of a man who had spent his whole life learning that the world is full of things called worthless by people who never bothered to test them. The trucks came for 15 years. Let me tell you what that looked like. 3 or 4 loads a day in a busy month, each load 18 tons of hot slag dumped while it still steamed in the cold air, then graded flat by a dozer the mill kept on site, then left to cure under the rain and the sun. The pile did not stay a pile. It became a plateau, a gray tableland 11 acres wide and in places 15 feet deep, and over the seasons it weathered, and grass tried to grow on the older parts of it, and Walt walked it. That was the thing nobody noticed for years. Walt Haney walked his slag the way another man walks his fields. He would go out in the evening after the mill trucks had stopped, and he would pick up pieces and turn them over in his hand and set them down. He was reading it. He just had not told anyone what he was reading yet. The man who would become the proximate voice of the conventional world arrived in 1994, and his name was Dale Brunner. He was a metallurgist the mill had brought on to manage its waste compliance, a serious and educated man of about 40, with a degree from a good engineering school and a real command of the chemistry of steel. He was not a bad man. I want to be careful here because the easy version of this story makes him a villain, and he was not. Dale Brunner believed sincerely, and on the basis of everything he had been taught, that steel slag was a disposal problem and nothing more. He had the data. He knew what the stuff was made of, and he knew the one quiet flaw inside it that made the whole industry nervous. That flaw had a name, and Walt learned it from Brunner himself on the day the two men first stood at the fence together. Brunner had come to walk the dump and certify it for the state, and he found Walt already standing on the slag, turning a piece in his hand. Brunner introduced himself, polite and a little wary, and Walt asked him a plain question. He asked why the mill was so eager to give the rock away when the township paid good money for crushed limestone not 3 miles up the road. And Brunner, who was an honest man and could not help explaining things he understood, told him. The problem, Brunner said, was free lime and free magnesium oxide. When you make steel, some of the lime you add to the furnace never fully reacts. It comes out in the slag as raw, unreacted oxide. And raw lime is a thirsty thing. It wants water. When water reaches it, even years later, it swells, it expands, it turns from a hard mineral into a soft, hydrated powder and pushes outward with real force. Brunner explained it the way a teacher explains a hard truth to a slow student, kindly, and a little above it all. You put fresh steel slag under a road, he said, and in 2 or 3 years the free lime hydrates, and the base swells and the pavement heaves and cracks, and you have spent good money building a road that destroys itself from underneath. That, he said, is why nobody reputable uses this material for construction. It is a liability. He used that word. He said it with the calm certainty of a man who had never once been wrong about anything in his field, and he was not being cruel. He was trying to keep a farmer from a costly mistake. Walt listened to the whole thing. Then he asked one more question, and it was the question of his life, though Brunner did not recognize it. Walt asked how long it took the free lime to finish hydrating if you just left the rock out in the rain and did nothing. Brunner shrugged. Years, he said. Nobody knows exactly. Nobody waits around to find out. There is no money in waiting. And he wrote his report, and he certified the dump, and he drove his clean company truck back to the mill, and he thought no more about the quiet old man on the rock pile. He had no way of knowing that he had just handed Walt Haney the one piece of the puzzle Walt had been missing for 4 years. Let me tell you what Walt understood that Brunner did not, and it is the heart of this whole thing. So stay with me a moment. Brunner saw a liability that would always be a liability. Walt heard something different. He heard that the only problem with the rock was time. Time was the one thing Walt Haney had in greater supply than any mill in America. The mill could not wait. A mill is a fast machine that has to move its waste, today, this week, this quarter. It cannot leave 11 acres of rock sitting in the rain for a decade, doing nothing, earning nothing. A farmer, though. A farmer's whole life is the patience to let a slow process finish on its own schedule. Brunner had told him the rock was poison until it cured. Walt heard that the rock would cure itself if a man were only willing to wait, and that the very thing that made it worthless to the mill, the years of weathering, was the thing that would make it valuable to anyone patient enough to let it happen. So Walt began to test. This is the part the credentialed world never saw, because it happened in the evenings and on Sundays over the better part of a decade. He took a leather-bound ledger his own father had used to track field yields, a thick book with a cracked spine and pages gone soft at the corners, and he turned it into a record of the rock. He marked off sections of the dump by the year the slag had been laid down, because the mill's own grading had stacked it in rough strata, oldest at the bottom and east end, freshest at the top and west. He took samples from each section. And he built himself a test that any farmer would understand and no laboratory would have bothered with. Here's what he did. And it was genuinely clever. The danger of the rock was that it swelled when it got wet. So Walt needed to know which rock had stopped swelling. He took measured samples from each year's slag, weighed them on a feed scale, soaked them in buckets of creek water for 30 days, dried them, and weighed them again. Fresh slag, 2 or 3 years old, gained weight and crumbled, the free lime drinking the water and bursting the stone from inside. He could see it. The bucket would have a skin of gray paste on the bottom. The older slag, the rock that had sat in the rain through 8 winters and 9 summers, did something else. It soaked and dried and weighed exactly what it had weighed before it had finished. The free lime was all hydrated already, spent, harmless, turned to stable mineral years ago out in the open weather. That rock was done moving. That rock would never heave a road, because it had already done all its heaving, lying in a field where it could hurt nothing. He wrote it all down, page after page, year by year, soak test by soak test, in a hand that got more confident as the ledger filled. By 2001, he knew something no metallurgist in the state had bothered to learn, because there had been no money in learning it. He knew exactly how long Vance Steele's particular slag took to cure to stability under open weathering in the Ohio climate. The answer was about 7 years. Slag older than 7 years on his dump was, by his own repeated test, as stable as any quarried stone, and it carried properties the limestone did not. It was harder. It was more angular, which meant it locked together under load instead of rolling. It drained better. And there was a great deal of it, 11 acres, 15 feet deep in places, and the oldest and best of it had been sitting there curing quietly since the trucks first came, he told Edith. He brought the ledger to the walnut table one winter night, and he showed her the soak tests and the dates, and he told her what he meant to do, which was to wait until enough of the pile had cured, and then build a stone business out of the rock the mill had paid him to take. She looked at the columns of figures for a long time. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "What happens," she said, "when the mill wants the land back, now that you have found a use for their garbage?" And Walt did not have an answer for that one yet. He folded the question into the ledger, and he kept it there. "I'll tell you what happened with the mill in a moment, because it matters. First, though, you should meet the daughter, because she is the one who almost talked him out of it, and she is the one who, in the end, carried it forward. And the distance between those two facts is the truest thing in this story. If you have ever come home from school certain you knew more than the people who raised you, you will recognize her, and I would be glad to hear about it. Her name was Carol. Carol Haney had left the county at 18 and come back at 26, with a degree in civil engineering and 4 years at a paving contractor's office downstate. And she came back because her mother had written that her father was spending his evenings, and she was worried he had gone soft in the head. Carol loved her father. That has to be said plainly, because what she did next, she did out of love and not contempt. Sixth, she had, however, been trained in exactly the worldview that Dale Brunner carried, and she knew the standard specifications cold, and she knew that no state DOT in the country approved raw steel furnace slag as a road base because of the free lime expansion problem. She had read the specs, she had seen the failed test sections, and here was her father, 68 now, telling her he was going to sell steel slag to township road crews as premium base aggregate. She tried to stop him. They had it out at the kitchen table on her third night home, and it was not a shouting match, because Haneys do not shout, but it was hard. She brought the specification book, and she put it on the walnut table next to his ledger, and she opened to the section that disqualified his rock. "Dad," she said, "this isn't knowledge. It's just stubbornness with a notebook. The whole industry knows this material fails. I've watched it fail. You're going to sell a township, a road, that heaves in 3 years, and you'll be liable for every foot of it, and it will take the farm." She thought the word liability would land the way it had in her textbooks. She had no idea she was repeating Dale Brunner. Almost word for word, 7 years later, the same dismissal in a younger mouth. Walt let her finish. Then he did not argue with her specification book. He did something better. He took her out to the dump the next morning, and he handed her a piece of fresh slag from the west end and a piece of cured slag from the east end and 2 buckets, and he told her to do the soak test herself and not to take his word for anything. Carol, who was an engineer and could not resist a test, did it. She soaked both pieces for 30 days through the back half of that winter, and the fresh piece swelled and crumbled and left its gray paste in the bottom of the bucket exactly as the textbook said it would, and the old piece came out of the water after 30 days, weighing within a gram of what it went, in weighing hard and whole and done. She waited 3 times because she did not believe it. The textbook had told her the material was bad. The textbook had not told her that the material changed, that there was a clock running on the badness, and that her father had spent 15 years timing it. That was the first crack in her certainty and the seed of doubt It opened, never closed again. She did not convert all at once, though. She went back to her specification book and found the real obstacle, the one that would have stopped Walt cold without her. And this is where the daughter became necessary rather than merely doubtful. The problem was not whether the rock was good. Carol now suspected it was. The problem was that no road engineer in the state was permitted to spec a material that was not on the approved list and did not come with laboratory documentation of its expansion behavior. Walt's ledger, however careful, was a farmer's notebook. It would not pass. To sell the rock as what it was, somebody was going to have to prove it the way the credentialed world demanded to be shown in a certified lab with the standard expansion test, run to the standard, on paper, an engineer could sign. Let me tell you about that test, because the irony of it is the whole point. The standard test for steel slag expansion soaks a compacted sample in hot water for 7 days and measures how much it swells. 7 days. The entire official method for deciding whether slag was safe rested on a 1-week soak. Walt's rock had been soaking in the open Ohio weather for 15 years. The lab test was a 1-week imitation of exactly the thing Walt's East End slag had already survived 1,000 times over, through 15 real winters. Carol understood this the moment she read the method against her father's ledger. The official world had been running a 7-day test because it could not afford to wait 15 years. Her father had simply afforded to wait. He had run the real test at full scale over a decade and a half and called it being patient. The certified lab procedure was a small, fast model of her father's enormous slow truth. So Carol took it to a lab. She used her contacts from the paving contractor, she packaged samples from each of Walt's dated strata, and she paid for the certified expansion test out of her own savings without telling him, because she wanted to know, herself, before she let her father risk the farm. The results came back in the spring of 2002. The fresh slag failed, expanding well past the limit. The East End slag, the cured rock, expanded by a fraction of a percent, far inside the tightest specification the state had. It was on certified paper, now a stable, premium aggregate. Carol sat in her car in the lab parking lot with the report in her lap for a long time. Then she drove home and put the certified report on the walnut table next to her father's ledger, and she said the only thing there was to say. "You were right," she said, "and the rock changes. Nobody told me the rock changes." Walt looked at the two documents side by side, his soft-cornered ledger and her crisp lab report, the slow truth and the fast proof of the same fact, and he said, "I know it does. I watched it." Now, let me tell you the thing. Carol's report could not, which is that knowing you are right and being allowed to sell it are two different countries, and the border between them was the mill. Because here is what had been happening on the other side of the fence while Walt tested his rock. Vance steel had been dying. Through the late 90s, the American steel industry took blow after blow, and the Vance finishing mill, old and small and uncompetitive, lost money every year. In 2001, it filed for bankruptcy. And in the cold arithmetic of a bankruptcy, every asset gets looked at, including 11 acres of slag sitting on a farmer's land, under a lease that paid the mill nothing and cost it the disposal fees it could no longer afford. The bankruptcy trustee, going through the books, found the slag lease and saw it as the company saw everything now as a number. The slag, the trustee was told by the company's own remaining engineer, was a liability, an environmental obligation, 11 acres of regulated waste the estate was responsible for. and the trustee wanted it gone. The man the trustee sent to deal with it was Dale Bruner. He had stayed on through the bankruptcy as the last technical man standing, and in the spring of 2002, the same season Carol's lab report came back, Brunner drove out to the Haney farm for the second time in his life to inform Walt that the estate intended to terminate the lease, reclaim its waste obligation, and have the slag hauled off to a permitted landfill, which, under the terms of the old lease, the mill had the right to do. He was again not cruel about it. He was almost apologetic. He stood at the same fence where he had explained free lime to Walt 8 years before, and he told the old farmer that the rock was being taken away because it was worthless and someone had to pay to bury it, and the estate had decided it would not be them if they could help it, which meant a fight over who owned the obligation. He assumed Walt would be glad to see the eyesore go. Walt was not glad. Walt understood in that moment that the mill was about to haul away 7 years of his life and the most valuable thing on his farm and pay to bury it, all because the people doing it could only see what they had been trained to see. And here is where the story could have ended, with the cured rock trucked off to a landfill and Walt's ledger turned to nothing but a record of a thing that used to be. It did not end there because of 2 things. The first was that Walt, for once in his life, did not stay quiet. The second was that his daughter had a certified lab report in her car. They met the trustee's people in a lawyer's office in the county seat, and it was the closest thing to a confrontation Walt Haney ever had. The estate's position was simple. The slag was a regulated waste and an environmental liability, and the estate wanted it off its books, and the lease let them remove it. Bruner was there to provide the technical backing to certify the rock as waste. And Carol was there, and she had brought the report. She let Bruner give his whole explanation, the free lime, the expansion, the liability, the same speech her father had heard at the fence in 1994. Then she slid the certified expansion report across the table to him and asked him to read the figures for the East End material, the cured rock, and to tell the room as the estate's own engineer whether a material that expanded that little was a regulated waste or a premium construction aggregate. Brunner read it. He was an honest man, and that was the thing that saved them, because a dishonest man would have lied, and the report would have become a fight between experts. Brunner read the numbers, and he went quiet, and then he did the bravest thing a credentialed man can do. He said the rock had changed. He said that he had certified this material as waste 8 years ago, based on its free lime content, and that he had been technically correct at the time, and that he had not accounted for the effect of long-term open weathering because nobody in his field ever had, because there had never been a reason to wait long enough to measure it. The man, he said, nodding at Walt, waited long enough to measure it, and on the strength of his own honesty, the certified rock was reclassified. It was not waste. It was Walt's, cured on Walt's land, and the estate had no obligation to haul away and no right to take a material that was now on paper, a valuable aggregate. The trustee, who only cared about the number, lost interest the moment the liability became an asset he could not claim. The lease was dissolved. The rock stayed. Carol told me years later that the thing she remembered most was the drive home. Her father did not gloat. He did not say a word about being right for the second time in front of the same man. He looked out the truck window at the fields going by, and after a long while he said only that Bruner was a good man, and it had cost him something to say what he said, and that she should remember that the next time she was sure of something, that was all. Let me tell you, that kind of silence after winning is rarer than any rock. Now the rock was theirs, and proven, and the real work began, and Walt was 69 years old. This is the stretch where the foil comes in, because Walt was not the only man in Vance County trying to build a future on the ground, and the contrast tells you everything. Let me tell you about Glenn Forsyth. Glenn farmed 1,200 acres on the good high ground north of town, 4 times Walt's land and 10 times his equipment. And through the early 2000s, Glenn had done what the credentialed world told every farmer to do. He had borrowed against his land to scale up, bought a new self-propelled sprayer for $200,000, leased a fleet of the newest equipment, signed contracts to grow a single high-yield corn variety for an ethanol plant, and consolidated everything around efficiency and volume. On paper, Glenn was the success, and Walt was the eccentric old man with the rock pile. The bank loved Glenn. The extension agents held him up as the model. And Glenn was, like everyone in this story, a decent man, doing what the smartest people he knew told him to do. He was not foolish. He was conventional, which in a stable world is the same as wise, and which in an unstable world is something else. Walt and Carol built their business slow. The only way they could, the way that turned out to be the whole secret. They had no money to scale. So Carol designed the operation around the one thing they had, which was a great deal of free, cured, proven rock, and the patience to sell it right. They bought a used screening plant at an auction, a sorting machine that shook the slag over graded screens to separate it into sizes, base rock and surface gravel and fine material. They kept Walt's one dump truck. Carol built the specification package, the certified test results, the gradation reports, everything an engineer needed to put their material into a road with a clear conscience, the paper bridge between her father's slow knowledge and the fast world's requirements, and they gave it a name. Walt would not put his own name on it. He said the rock had made itself, and he had only waited. So they stenciled a name on the barn wall and on the side of the truck taken from the creek that ran along the back of the dump where the oldest rock had cured the longest. They called it Tylersville Aggregate. Let me tell you why the rock was actually better, because this is not a story where the underdog wins on sentiment. Walt's cured slag genuinely outperformed the limestone the townships had been buying. Steel slag is denser and harder than limestone, so it resisted the grinding wear of loaded trucks longer. Its particles were sharply angular rather than rounded, so when you compacted it, the pieces interlocked and locked up into a base that did not shift under load the way rounder gravel did. And because the free lime had fully cured, it had none of the expansion problem and all of the strength. A road built on properly cured steel slag base was, by every measure that mattered to a county that had to maintain it for 30 years, a better road than one built on limestone, and it could be sold for less because the raw material had cost nothing but time. Carol ran the numbers, and they were not close. The cured slag base outlasted limestone by years and cost the township less per ton delivered. The first sale was the hardest, because no engineer wanted to be the first to sign. Carol took the specification package to township after township through 2003 and 2004, and watched men who trusted her father's word about stone for 30 years balk the moment it was steel slag and not limestone, because the word slag carried Brunner's old fear in it. The dismissal followed them. At a county engineers meeting in the winter of 2004, a younger engineer from a neighboring county, holding Carol's own spec sheet, called the material a boutique gimmick, and said he would not gamble a road on a farmer's rock pile, no matter how many tests the daughter ran to prop up her father's hobby. It was the third time the word had been thrown, the same dismissal in a third mouth, and Carol felt it land. She had learned her father's trick by then. She did not argue. She offered the man something instead. She offered to build one road at her own cost on the worst, wettest, most frost-heaved township road in his county, and to let him core it after 3 winters. And if it had heaved a single inch, she would haul the material out herself and apologize in front of the same meeting. No one turns down a free road built on a bet. The engineer took it. Which brings us back to Glenn Forsyth, because while Carol was building her bet road, the structural shock that decides this whole story was already moving toward both of them, and it did not care which man had been called wise. In the late summer of 2004 and on through 2005, 2 things happened at once. The price of natural gas spiked hard, and natural gas was what the ethanol and fertilizer economy ran on, and the single variety, high-input, debt-financed model that Glenn had built his 1,200 acres around suddenly cost far more to run. His fertilizer bill doubled, his fuel bill climbed, and the ethanol contract that was supposed to be his security repriced against him. At the same time, the autumn of 2004 brought a wet, freezing, brutal winter, the kind of deep frost cycle that finds every weakness in a road and every weakness in a balance sheet. That winter did to the county's limestone roads exactly what frost does. It got into the base, it froze and thawed and froze again, and the rounded limestone shifted, and the roads cracked and potholed and broke up, and the townships faced a spring of expensive repairs they could not afford. The frost did something else, though, something nobody had engineered or expected. It hit Carol's bet road, too, the one she had built on cured steel slag on the worst road in a skeptic's county, and the bet road did not move. The angular, interlocked, fully cured slag base held through the worst freeze in 20 years without a crack, because the very density and angularity that made the rock hard to handle made it nearly immune to frost shift, and because there was no free lime left in it to swell. When the skeptic engineer cored it that spring, 2 years ahead of his own 3-winter deadline, because he could not wait, he found the base as tight and sound as the day it went in. And Glenn Forsyth, on his high good ground, did not make it. The gas spike and the wet year and the debt came together the way a frost finds a road, all the weak points at once, and in the spring of 2005, the bank that had loved him called his notes, and Glenn sold the new sprayer for 1/3 of what he paid and let the leases go and pulled his operation back to 1/4 of its size to survive. He was not ruined as a man. The confident, efficient, scaled-up model that everyone had held up against Walt's rock pile broke in a single hard year because it had been built with no slack in it, every acre leveraged to the same single bet. And when the one bet went wrong, I want to be careful here, the way Walt was careful about Brunner. Glenn did nothing stupid. He did exactly what the wise men said. He simply built something rigid in a world that turned out to be rough, and the roughness found him. Let me tell you what happened that spring, because the vindication, when it came quiet, the way Walt would have wanted it. The county road engineer for Vance County itself, a veteran named Ross Keller, who had spaced stone for 20 years and had watched the limestone roads break up all winter, drove out to core the bet road for himself after he heard what the neighboring county had found. He spent a morning on it. He pulled cores, he ran them, he checked them against Carroll's certified package and against the broken limestone roads in his own county. And then he drove to the Haney farm, and he found Walt and Carol at the screening plant, and he did the thing that turns a stubborn man's rock pile into a brand. He wrote them a purchase order on the spot for the base aggregate to rebuild the worst 8 miles of county road in the township, and he signed it, and the number on it was $40,000. 40,000. It does not sound like a fortune, and it was not. You have to understand what it was a verdict on. It was the first time a credentialed county engineer had put his signature and his professional judgment on a piece of paper that said Walt Haney's cured slag was not a liability, not a hobby, not a gimmick, but the premium base aggregate of record for the roads of the county he had farmed his whole life. Ross Keller handed Walt the purchase order, and Walt held it in his grease-stained hands and read it twice, and he did not say anything for a moment. Then he said only that he would have the first load screened by Friday. Keller told Carroll later that he had never in 20 years spaced a better base material, and that he could not understand why no one had thought to simply let the rock cure and test it. Carroll told him the truth. Someone had. He just hadn't been the kind of someone the spec book counted. The order was the door. Once the county of record used it and signed off on it, the other townships came, the ones who had balked for 2 years, and they came not as a favor but because their own limestone roads had broken in the same frost that Walt's slag had shrugged off. Through 2005 and 2006, Tylersville Aggregate sold, cured, screened, certified steel slag base to 7 townships and 2 counties, and the 11 acres of rock the mill had paid Walt to take and then tried to pay to haul away became the foundation under better roads across that part of Ohio. They never scaled it beyond what the dump could supply and what Walt's slow testing could prove. They turned down an offer from a regional materials company to buy the operation and license the name, because licensing the name meant selling rock that had not cured the full 7 years, and Walt would not put Tylersville on a stone that was not done. The whole value of the thing was that it was honest, and honesty does not scale past the truth. Let me tell you about Dale Bruner one more time, because this story would be empty without him, and because what he did is the part I think about most. After the mill closed for good and the bankruptcy wound down, Brunner was out of work, a metallurgist in a county that no longer made steel. And in 2006, he drove out to the Haney farm a 3rd time, not to dismiss anything, but to ask Walt and Carroll for a job. He had spent 30 years certifying that steel slag was waste, and he had watched an old farmer prove with a feed scale and a leather ledger that the waste was only uncured aggregate. And he wanted, he said, to spend whatever working years he had left helping to do it right. Carroll hired him. Of course she hired him. He knew the chemistry of the rock better than anyone alive, and now he knew the one thing his chemistry had never told him, which was how long to wait. Brunner spent his last working decade running the testing lab at Tylersville Aggregate, the same man who had called the rock a liability, now signing the certifications that sold it. And he was, Carroll said, the best and most careful tester she ever had, because a man who has been wrong once in a way that humbled him is never careless again. Walt Haney worked the screening plant until he was past 75, and then he slowed, and Carroll ran it, and the operation stayed exactly the size the cured rock would honestly support, which was the whole point, the only point. They paid off the farm. They put cured slag under the township roads of their own county and watched those roads outlast every limestone road around them. And the proof of the method was not in any document, but in the simple fact that the roads did not break. Carroll kept her father's ledger in the lab office under glass, next to the certified reports, the slow book, and the fast paper telling the same truth, and she showed it to every new hire and to the young engineers who came now to learn how it was done, because they did come, the way they always come, once the thing is proven, skeptical at first and then not. Let me tell you what this story is about, now that you have heard it, because I think it is about something larger than a rock pile in Ohio. There are two kinds of knowledge in the world, and they were both standing at that fence in 1994. One kind is wide and fast and confident and credentialed. It knows the chemistry of the lime. It knows the specification. It knows what the industry knows, and it is usually right, and it cannot afford to wait. The other kind is narrow and slow and patient and unlettered, and it knows one piece of ground and one pile of rock the way a man knows his own hands, and it can afford to wait, because waiting is the only wealth it has ever had. Dale Brunner had the first kind, and he was not wrong. He was only incomplete, because the one thing his vast knowledge could never include was the answer to a question that took 15 years to ask. Walt Haney had the second kind, and he was right. Not because he was smarter, but because he was patient. And the rock rewarded patience. And a mill, by its nature, can never be patient. The thing a system measures and the thing that is truly valuable are not always the same thing. The mill measured the slag as a disposal cost and was correct by its own clock. The farmer measured it as a stone that needed time and was correct. By his, the difference was not intelligence. The difference was that one of them was willing to wait for the rock to finish becoming what it already was, and the other could not. And in the gap between those two clocks, an old man with a feed scale built a brand out of the thing thrown at his fence. Edith Haney lived to see the roads built. Quote, she lived to ride with her husband over a smooth township road laid on the rock she had once called his junkyard, and Walt, who never gloated at any man, allowed himself exactly one quiet thing as they drove it. A man does not throw away rock, he said, until he knows what the rock is. She did not call him a fool that time. The walnut table is still in the kitchen, and the ledger is still under glass in the lab. And out along the Tylersville Road, the slag the mill could not wait to bury, holds up the roads it built, hard and angular and finally finished, doing the slow, quiet work that the patient rock was always going to do for anyone who had the years to let it.